Right, let's dive straight into this explainer. Today, we're taking a heavily data-driven look at India's unprecedented clean energy transition. Because as we sit here in 2026, the country is facing a completely fascinating paradox. We are seeing record-breaking, absolute booms in green energy generation, but they're colliding head-on with some incredibly massive, systemic growing pains.
To really wrap our heads around the scale of what's happening, we need to look at just one number: 0.7%. In 2025, India's CO2 emissions grew by a mere 0.7%. Now, if we exclude the massive anomaly of the 2020 pandemic, that is actually the slowest rate of emissions growth the country has seen in more than 2 decades. It's a staggering achievement.
And that brings us to the central mystery here, which is honestly a global game changer. India's economy is expanding at a breakneck pace, driving hard towards high-income status with absolutely surging industrial output. Yet, somehow, the nation is slamming the brakes on its carbon footprint and completely avoiding environmental stagnation. So, how exactly is this decoupling playing out on the ground?
Section 1. The decoupling milestone, where policy meets reality.
The absolute bedrock of all this is India's newly approved Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, for the 2031 to 2035 period. The government has locked in some seriously ambitious targets. They're aiming for a massive 47% drop in the emissions intensity of their GDP by 2035 compared to 2005 levels. Alongside that, they want 60% of their cumulative electric power capacity to come from non-fossil sources by that same year. And all of this serves as a massive stepping stone towards their ultimate net zero goal by 2070.
To actually enforce this, they've rolled out the Carbon Credit Trading Scheme, or CCTS. This legally binds over 700 entities across 9 highly energy-intensive sectors to slash their emission intensity. In this initial phase, cement and aluminum plants are being forced to make significant cuts, whilst the pulp and paper industry has to reduce its intensity by up to 15%. It's a backloaded system, which basically means the pressure to reduce those emissions is only going to get heavier and heavier over the next couple of years.
And you know what? The results are already showing up in the data. In 2025, power sector emissions actually plummeted by 3.8%. This was driven by a record 90 terawatt-hours of clean energy being added to the grid in just a single year. To put that into perspective, outside of the pandemic, this was the very first drop in coal power generation in India since 1973. I mean, it is an absolutely historic milestone.
Section 2. The $17 billion energy bet, capital flowing in.
For 2026 alone, the total projected investment in India's energy sector is set to hit a record-breaking $170 billion. Capital is just pouring in from both the public and private sectors. It's all aimed at supporting this surging electricity demand whilst keeping an eye on long-term decarbonization.
Now, what's really fascinating about this breakdown is the dual approach they're taking. We're seeing massive investments in tomorrow's energy, like $26 billion for grid modernization and another $20 billion for solar. But crucially, India is still expending $13 billion on coal, alongside heavy investments in oil refining. So they're simultaneously funding this massive green transition, whilst ensuring their conventional baseloads can still actually meet the immediate day-to-day demands of a booming population.
But make no mistake, solar is undeniably the star of the show here. Just look at the last financial year alone, where India added nearly 45 gigawatts of solar capacity. And the government is pushing even further. The newly approved PM-SSY scheme dedicates over 5,000 crore rupees to develop 5,000 megawatts of floating solar on reservoirs. You add to that the PM Surya Ghar initiative, which has already helped over 43 lakh households install rooftop solar. The generation capacity is literally expanding everywhere you look.
It all sounds like the perfect success story, doesn't it? But here is the critical pivot. We really have to ask, where does all this new power actually go once the sun hits those panels?
Section 3. The transmission bottleneck, the grid reality.
Because, as it turns out, building solar plants is one thing. Building the transmission lines to carry that power across a massive subcontinent is a completely different beast. This is perhaps the most shocking statistic in our entire explainer today. Right now, up to half, between 30 and 50% of newly generated solar power at certain affected substations is being curtailed. That means the energy is effectively just being thrown away during peak daylight hours, simply because the grid cannot handle the surge.
The main culprit here is something known as TGNA, or Temporary General Network Access, because the permanent transmission lines simply haven't kept pace with the sheer speed of solar construction. Developers are being forced to use these short-term, stopgap grid connections. Across the northern, western, and southern regions, 37% of all renewable capacity is relying on these temporary measures, and that is severely eating into developer revenues whenever that generation gets curtailed.
If we take a closer look at where this gridlock is hitting the hardest, it's exactly where the solar boom is the loudest. The incredibly sun-rich western region has seen peak curtailments hitting over 8,600 megawatts, whilst the northern region is curtailing over 5,500 megawatts. The transmission infrastructure is quite literally choking on the success of the solar rollout.
Section 4. The Green Hydrogen Gap. Industrial Transition.
Now, under the National Green Hydrogen Mission, India wants to become a global production hub. But the crucial point here is comparing that massive ambition with the current on-the-ground reality. The target for 2030 is 5 million tons of green hydrogen per year. However, as of February 2026, the actual commissioned operational capacity is just 8,000 tons.
And the reason for this immense gap becomes immediately obvious the second you look at the economics. Recent competitive bidding discovered prices for green hydrogen sitting at around 387 to 397 rupees per kilogram. But conventional gray hydrogen, which is made from natural gas, only costs about 150 to 200 rupees per kilogram. So right now, green hydrogen is roughly twice as expensive.
So why is there such a massive price premium? Well, the renewable energy alone makes up 50 to 70% of the total production cost. Add to that the highly expensive capital expenditures required for electrolyzers, a severe lack of long-term buyer agreements to actually secure financing, and a domestic storage and transport infrastructure that is, frankly, still very much in its infancy.
Section 5. Fixing the Gridlock. Market Adaptation.
To survive these massive transmission bottlenecks and the hydrogen hurdles, the market is having to adapt fast. Buyers are increasingly shifting away from standard intermittent solar contracts and demanding FDRE, that stands for Firm and Dispatchable Renewable Energy. Essentially, these are projects integrated with battery storage to guarantee a steady, round-the-clock power output, which massively reduces those sudden surges that end up overwhelming the grid.
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact multi-billion-dollar steps being taken to bridge the gap. The government is directly mandating 10,000 megawatt-hours of battery storage alongside its new floating solar schemes. They're pouring that $26 billion into grid modernization to build the permanent transmission lines that are so desperately required. And they are aggressively subsidizing domestic electrolyzer manufacturing to try and drive down the ultimate cost of green hydrogen.
At the end of the day, it all comes down to capital and scale. As one industry expert neatly summarized it in our sources, green hydrogen in India is not a technology challenge anymore. It is fundamentally an economic and financing challenge. The science absolutely works. Now, the maths has to work too.
Which leaves us with this final, somewhat provocative thought for today's explainer. The capital is there, the ambitious targets are locked in, and the generation capacity is exploding at record speeds. But the physical reality of laying cables, building batteries, and manufacturing electrolyzers takes real time. The ultimate question for 2026 and beyond isn't whether India can generate green energy, it's whether they can build a grid fast enough to catch the sun. Thanks for joining me, and I hope this helped clear up the complex mechanics behind India's current energy paradox.